For almost 20 years, one question hung over a small town in Alabama and over anyone who followed the news back in 2005. What really happened to Natalee Holloway? She was 18 years old, she had just finished high school, and she was celebrating with her classmates on a graduation trip to the island of Aruba. Then, one night she vanished. No trace, no body, no clear answer. For almost 2 decades, her mother searched, begged, and fought for the truth. And now, finally, that truth has come out. But here's the hard part. It isn't the ending anyone wanted. It's worse than most people imagined. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why her family says this so-called closure feels less like justice and more like a fresh wound. Let's go back to where it all started, because to understand how dark this case really got, you need to see how it began. In May of 2005, Natalee Holloway graduated from high school in Mountain Brook, Alabama, a quiet, close-knit community where everybody seemed to know everybody else, and where a story like hers would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. To celebrate, she joined a group of more than 100 classmates on a trip to Aruba, a small island in the Caribbean known for its beaches and its nightlife. It was supposed to be 5 days of fun before she started college that fall. She had already been accepted and was excited to study medicine, with dreams of becoming a doctor one day. She was smart, she was well-liked, and she had her whole life ahead of her. Friends who traveled with her later described those days as some of the happiest of her life, filled with pool parties, late nights, and the kind of carefree excitement that comes right before everything changes. Nobody on that trip could have imagined it would end the way it did. On the final night of the trip, May 30th, Natalee went out with friends to a local bar. That night, she met a young man named Joran van der Sloot. He was 20 years old, the son of a well-connected local judge, and he had grown up on the island. His family's connections would later become a major point of controversy, with critics accusing local authorities of treating him with more caution and care than an ordinary suspect might have received. Natalee left the bar with Joran and 2 brothers he knew, Deepak and Satish Kalpo. That was the last time anyone who knew her ever saw her again. The next morning, when Natalee didn't show up for her flight home, her friends panicked. At first, some assumed she had simply overslept after a long night out, but as the hours passed and she didn't answer calls or show up anywhere on the island, panic turned into full-blown fear. Her mother, Beth Holloway, flew to Aruba almost immediately and refused to leave until she got answers. She would end up staying on the island for weeks, sleeping very little, pushing local police daily, and becoming a fixture at every press conference and search effort. What followed was one of the largest missing persons searches in Caribbean history. Divers searched the ocean. Cadaver dogs combed the beaches. Fighter jets with heat sensors flew over the island looking for any sign of a body. Ponds were drained. Landfills were dug through not once, but multiple times. Volunteers from the island and beyond joined in, walking mile after mile of coastline, checking every cave and every patch of brush that might hide a clue. Tips poured in from strangers, claiming they had seen something, and each one had to be chased down, even when most led absolutely nowhere. And through it all, nothing. No body. No physical evidence. Just silence, and a growing sense of dread that settled over the entire island. From the very start, all eyes were on Joran van der Sloot. He was the last person seen with Natalee, and almost immediately, his story started falling apart. First, he said he and his friends dropped her off at her hotel. Then he changed his story and said he left her alone on the beach. Then another version came out. The details kept shifting every time he opened his mouth, and each new version raised more questions than it answered. Police arrested him along with the Kalpo brothers. They were held, questioned, and eventually released without charges because there simply wasn't enough hard evidence to hold them. Under Aruban law, suspicion alone isn't enough to keep someone locked up forever. And as the months dragged on, the case that had captured the entire world's attention started going cold. For Beth, every single release of a suspect felt like watching the truth slip further out of reach. And she said later that those early months taught her a devastating lesson about how differently the legal system can move compared to how quickly a mother's heart breaks. But Joran van der Sloot didn't disappear from the story. If anything, he seemed to enjoy staying in it. Over the next several years, he gave interview after interview, always dropping just enough detail to keep people talking, and always finding a way to walk it back the moment anyone pressed him for the truth. It almost seemed like a game to him, a way to stay relevant, to feel powerful, to control a narrative that had made him infamous around the world. Psychologists who later studied his behavior pointed to a pattern common in people who crave control above almost everything else. Someone who enjoyed holding a grieving family's hope in his hands and squeezing it whenever he felt like it. Some experts even compared his behavior to that of a con artist, someone who studied exactly how much truth to reveal in order to keep himself relevant without ever giving investigators enough to build an airtight case. In one interview with an American news network, he claimed Natalee wanted to be intimate with him, but he turned her down because he didn't have protection, and that she chose to stay behind on the beach alone. His own friend's lawyer said that story didn't add up. In another moment, caught on a hidden camera by a Dutch journalist, Van der Sloot appeared to admit he was there when Natalee died and that he had helped get rid of her body. When that recording went public, he laughed it off, claiming he only said it to trick someone he thought was a criminal into trusting him. Lie after lie, story after story, and every single time, Beth Holloway had to relive the worst moment of her life in public, with no way of knowing what was real. Then, in 2010, Van der Sloot did something almost unthinkable. He reached out to Beth Holloway directly, and he offered to tell her exactly where her daughter's body was buried. All she had to do was pay him $250,000. Grieving and desperate for any chance at closure, she agreed to send a down payment. He took the money, and he led her lawyer to a location that turned out to be completely fake. He had lied to a grieving mother about the location of her own daughter's remains, purely for money. Imagine believing, even for a single day, that you were finally going to bring your daughter home, only to have that hope ripped away by the very person who caused all your pain in the first place. Investigators later said this scheme wasn't improvised or desperate. It was calculated, methodical, and cruel. The work of someone who understood exactly what a grieving mother would be willing to do for even the smallest chance of an answer. This single act of cruelty is what finally caught up with him in the eyes of the law, because extortion and wire fraud are federal crimes in the United States, and years later, that exact case would be the reason he ended up back in an American courtroom. Here's where the story takes an even darker turn, one that most casual followers of the case never fully connected. Just months after extorting Beth Holloway, Van der Sloot moved to Peru. There, in a hotel room, he met a young woman named Stephanie Flores. The two got into an argument, and Van der Sloot beat her to death right there in the room. He was caught, tried, and convicted in Peru, and sentenced to 28 years in prison for her murder. Investigators in Peru later noted disturbing similarities to the Holloway case: a young woman alone with him, a sudden burst of violence, and an attempt afterward to cover his tracks. Reports from that investigation described a scene where he tried to flee the country almost immediately afterward, using a fake identity, which police said showed just how practiced he had become at evading consequences. Think about that for a moment. The same man who was the prime suspect in Natalee's disappearance went on to kill someone else, in almost eerily similar circumstances, a young woman he had just met, alone, in a moment of violence. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a pattern. For years, Van der Sloot sat in a Peruvian prison, and the Holloway case sat frozen in time. No new evidence. No new leads. Just a mother who refused to stop believing her daughter deserved the truth. She continued speaking publicly, writing, and advocating, even when there was little hope of any real movement in the case, because she believed silence would mean giving up on Natalee completely, and that was something she was never willing to do. Then in 2023, nearly 18 years after Natalee disappeared, everything changed almost overnight. American authorities arranged to have Van der Sloot temporarily extradited from Peru to Alabama to finally face the extortion and fraud charges tied to that $250,000 scam. As part of a plea deal to settle those charges, Van der Sloot agreed to do something he had refused to do for 18 years. He agreed to tell the full and complete truth about what happened to Natalee Holloway. And what he said in that quiet Birmingham courtroom was almost too disturbing to process. He admitted that on the beach that night, he tried to force himself on Natalee. When she said no and fought back, he became violent. He picked up a cinder block from nearby and struck her in the head with it. He said the blow killed her almost instantly. Then, to make sure she was never found, he dragged her body into the ocean and let the water take her away. No mystery. No elaborate cover-up involving secret conspiracies. Just a senseless, violent act, followed by nearly 2 decades of lies designed to protect himself, and at one particularly cruel point, to profit off a mother's grief. For Beth Holloway, hearing this confession after 18 years of searching was described as both a relief and a devastation at the same time. She had finally gotten the answer she'd been begging for since 2005. But the answer was that her daughter had been murdered in a burst of violence by someone she had just met hours earlier, and that this same man had spent almost 2 decades laughing in the face of her pain, selling her false hope, and hiding behind lie after lie. She said afterward that it was over, that Joran van der Sloot was no longer just a suspect. He was the confirmed killer. There was strength in how she said it, but anyone listening closely could hear the exhaustion underneath. 18 years is a long time to fight for the truth, and getting it doesn't undo a single day of that pain. Now here's the part that makes this whole story even harder to sit with. Even with a full confession, Natalee's body has still never been found, and experts say it likely never will be. If van der Sloot's account is accurate, her body was in the ocean for almost 2 decades. Tides, currents, and marine life make it almost impossible for anything to survive that long out there. Divers have searched. Fishermen have kept an eye out over the years. Every so often, a rumor surfaces that remains have washed ashore somewhere in the Caribbean, and each time, hope flickers briefly for the family before the lead turns out to be nothing at all. Marine experts explain that saltwater, tidal movement, and sea creatures work together in ways that make long-term preservation almost impossible, especially across such a long stretch of time. But the ocean doesn't preserve the way soil does. It scatters. It erases. So while the world finally has an answer to what happened that night, there may never be a physical resting place for Natalee. And that means there may never be full closure in the way most grieving families eventually find it. What makes this case so painful isn't just the murder itself. It's everything that came after. Van der Sloot didn't just kill Natalee and disappear. He stayed in the spotlight for almost 20 years, feeding off the attention, changing his story again and again, and even finding a way to hurt her mother a second time through the extortion scheme. Along the way, he went on to take another young woman's life in Peru, which raises a haunting question that will never fully be answered. If the truth about Natalee had come out sooner, if he had faced real consequences back in 2005, would Stephanie Flores still be alive today? It's a question with no comfortable answer, and it's part of why so many people who followed this case for years feel a strange mix of relief and anger now that the truth is finally public. The case also became something bigger than just one missing person investigation. It turned into a massive media event, with Natalee's face on television screens across the country for months. Her mother became a familiar figure on major news programs, tirelessly pushing for answers and keeping the pressure on Aruban authorities. Reporters camped outside courthouses, hotels, and even the family's home back in Alabama, hoping for any small update they could turn into a headline. For a while, it felt like the entire country was collectively holding its breath, waiting for a break in the case that, for years, simply never came. But the intense coverage also drew criticism. Many pointed out that missing young women who weren't white or wealthy rarely received anywhere near this level of national attention, a pattern that researchers and journalists later gave a name to, sometimes calling it missing white woman syndrome. The Holloway case, for all its heartbreak, ended up sparking a much larger conversation about which missing persons cases the media chooses to care about, and which ones get quietly ignored. There was also real tension on the island of Aruba itself. As the investigation dragged on without an arrest, some American politicians and public figures called for a full tourism boycott of the island, arguing that Americans weren't safe there. Aruban officials pushed back hard, insisting their island wasn't dangerous and that they were doing everything they could within the limits of their legal system. Businesses on the island suffered from the negative press, and locals felt like their home had been unfairly branded as a place where a young American woman could vanish without consequence. Hotel owners and tour operators later spoke about losing bookings for months, all because of a crime that had nothing to do with the island itself and everything to do with one man's decisions on a single night. It's a reminder that a case like this doesn't just affect one family. It ripples outward and touches an entire community thousands of miles away. Looking back now, with the full and horrifying truth finally on the table, it's hard to call this case solved in any satisfying way. Yes, the mystery has technically been answered. We know who killed Natalee Holloway, we know how, and we even know why. But there's no triumph in that answer. There's no moment where the pain simply lifts. Instead, there's a mother who spent 18 years fighting for the truth, only to learn that her daughter's death was as senseless and brutal as her worst fears, and that the man responsible spent nearly 2 decades laughing at her grief before finally admitting what he did. Sometimes the truth doesn't bring peace. Sometimes it just confirms the very worst thing you were always afraid to hear. And for the Holloway family, that may be the most painful part of this entire story, that after everything, after all those years of searching, all they were ever going to get was confirmation of a nightmare they already knew, deep down, was probably true all along.